The envelope disappeared at 8:17 on a Friday night, and before anyone found it, a frightened grandfather accused the wrong person of stealing his granddaughter's college money. Harrington House was full of Chicago's most powerful people, yet the room fell silent around a 19-year-old busboy named Noah, whose brown hands were still holding the linen napkins he had collected beneath the table. Henry Collins stood beside his wife with panic sharpening his voice, insisting the envelope had contained $12,000 in cashier's checks and cash, while the restaurant manager quietly moved between Noah and the growing circle of curious guests. Ava Bennett watched from the service station, remembering that Noah had recently lost his mother and was working double shifts to keep his younger sister in school, but she also knew sympathy could not replace evidence. At the corner table, billionaire investor Lucas Harrington observed the scene without moving, interested less in the missing money than in what people became when fear gave them permission to judge quickly. Daniel, the manager, asked Noah to empty his pockets, and the young man obeyed with a humiliation so complete that Ava felt it across the room before she understood what she intended to do. She placed her tray on the nearest table, asked Henry where he had last seen the envelope, then requested that Daniel stop the search until they retraced the couple's route from the entrance. Henry objected that every wasted minute gave a thief more time, but Ava answered that accusing the first vulnerable person was not the same as finding the truth. Her voice remained respectful, yet several guests shifted uneasily because she had named the cruelty they preferred to consider procedure. Lucas noticed that she did not defend Noah by declaring him innocent, which would have been emotional and careless, but by insisting that no one should be condemned before facts existed. Ava checked the coat room, the restroom corridor, and the narrow aisle beside the Collinses' table, where a server remembered moving Henry's chair after his cane had fallen. Beneath the adjoining booth, nearly hidden behind a brass floor vent, she found the envelope pressed against the wall, still sealed beneath Henry's handwritten note to his granddaughter. Relief crossed his face before shame replaced it, and he turned toward Noah with an apology that arrived too late to erase what the room had already witnessed. Noah accepted it because he needed the job more than he needed justice, then returned to the kitchen with his shoulders held rigid enough to conceal how badly his hands were shaking. Ava handed Henry the envelope without opening it, refused the $500 he tried to press into her palm, and asked him to speak to Noah again when fewer people were watching and pride was no longer performing for an audience. When Ava approached Lucas's table several minutes later, she found his untouched coffee cooling beside a leather portfolio and a silver pen worth more than her monthly rent. He asked whether she had refused the reward because accepting money would have weakened the moral impression she had just created, and Ava paused before answering because his question revealed more about him than it did about her. She told him she had refused because returning lost property was not a service anyone should have to purchase, although she would gladly accept payment for work she had actually agreed to perform. Lucas smiled faintly and asked whether every principal changed once the number became large enough, then offered $1 million if she would participate in a private experiment about integrity. Ava studied him long enough to understand that the offer was sincere, but not long enough to flatter him with surprise. She asked what he expected to receive in return, and Lucas explained that over the next 6 weeks he would present choices involving money, loyalty, ambition, and opportunity, none illegal or physically dangerous. If she demonstrated that conscience remained stronger than personal advantage, he would fund whatever future she desired without claiming ownership or repayment. Ava looked toward Noah, who was carrying dishes behind a swinging kitchen door after being publicly treated like a suspect, then asked whether Lucas planned to test only her or everyone affected by his decisions. The question unsettled him because he had imagined himself as an observer, standing outside the experiment, protected by wealth from the consequences he intended to measure. She told him she would consider the proposal only if every challenge was disclosed after it ended. No innocent person was harmed, and she retained the right to decide whether the money should be accepted at all. Lucas agreed too quickly, believing her conditions were merely evidence that she had already entered the game, while Ava understood something he did not yet recognize. A man who could offer $1 million to study a stranger had probably spent years mistaking control for understanding, and whatever happened next would reveal more about his character than hers. Before leaving his table, she asked him one final question, quietly enough that only he could hear it above the returning dinner conversation. She wanted to know what had happened to make a man surrounded by loyal employees, successful partners, and every material advantage so certain that goodness needed to be proven. Lucas did not answer, but the color drained slightly from his face as his fingers closed around the silver pen. That night, after Ava added $40 to the worn envelope labeled Coffee Shop Dream inside her locker, she found a business card tucked beneath the clasp. Lucas's private number appeared on the front, while the back contained a date, an address, and 6 handwritten words that made the proposition feel less like a game. The first choice will cost someone something. Ava stared at the sentence until the kitchen lights switched off behind her, wondering whether Lucas had issued a warning, made a threat, or admitted more truth than he intended. Across the city, Lucas opened a locked drawer in his office and removed an old newspaper clipping about his father's financial scandal, the betrayal that had taught him to distrust generosity long before he possessed enough money to test it. Beneath the headline was a photograph of a woman Ava had never met, although her name would soon make the entire experiment far more personal than either of them understood. The address on Lucas's card led Ava to a renovated warehouse on the west side, where Harrington Ventures was interviewing finalists for a neighborhood business grant that promised $200,000 and national publicity. Lucas met her in the lobby without assistance, then explained that she would spend one afternoon helping evaluate 4 applicants whose financial plans had already passed professional review. Her task appeared straightforward until he revealed that only one finalist could receive funding, while the others would lose leases they had tentatively secured based on the program's advertised timeline. Ava immediately questioned why rejected applicants faced consequences that severe, and Lucas admitted his company had encouraged each candidate to move quickly without guaranteeing support. He called it entrepreneurial risk, but she heard something colder beneath the polished language: the assumption that desperate people became useful data once wealthy institutions renamed pressure as opportunity. Among the finalists was Rosa Delgado, a widowed baker hoping to reopen the family shop destroyed by an electrical fire, and Marcus Reed, a former public school teacher proposing an affordable tutoring center near the neighborhood where Ava volunteered. The other applicants offered stronger profit projections, but their projects were luxury concepts designed for customers already well served by the city. Lucas told Ava the committee would consider her recommendation, then placed 4 sealed financial summaries before her and left the room, creating the appearance of complete freedom. While reviewing the documents, she noticed that Marcus's lease deposit had been listed as non-refundable, although the program brochure claimed finalists would receive reimbursement for approved preliminary expenses. When she asked the coordinator about the discrepancy, the woman quietly explained that Harrington Ventures had changed the policy after applications closed, a legal adjustment buried in an electronic notice most candidates had never opened. Ava requested a private conversation with Lucas and accused his company of manufacturing a moral dilemma by exposing applicants to losses they had not knowingly accepted. Lucas answered that business rewarded people who read every document, but she reminded him that power often hid unfairness inside paperwork, precisely because ordinary people lack teams of attorneys. She refused to choose a winner until every finalist received the reimbursement originally promised, even though Lucas warned that changing the rules would delay the grant and possibly cost Rosa her storefront. Ava understood the trap immediately, because accepting the unfair policy could help one person quickly, while resisting it might temporarily harm everyone. Instead of choosing between obedience and outrage, she proposed that Harrington Ventures cover the deposits from its discretionary marketing budget, an amount smaller than the company had spent promoting the competition. Lucas rejected the solution at first, insisting that exceptions weakened institutional discipline, until Ava asked whether discipline meant protecting a budget or honoring a promise made to people who had trusted his name. The question stirred an old memory he refused to discuss, and his hesitation allowed Rebecca Sloan, the company's chief operating officer, to enter with documents proving the reimbursement language had existed in every public announcement. Rebecca supported Ava's interpretation, although she warned that reversing the policy would embarrass the legal department and anger board member Michael Grant, who had approved the change. Lucas finally authorized payment to all finalists, but he did so with visible reluctance, not because he opposed fairness, but because accepting Ava's solution required admitting that his own organization had created the injustice. He then awarded the grant to Rosa, based on financial readiness, while offering Marcus a smaller pilot partnership through the company's education foundation. Outside the building, Ava told Lucas that he had not tested her integrity because the real decision had belonged to him from the beginning. He answered that she had still risked losing the $1 million by challenging the program rather than selecting the most sympathetic applicant. Ava said conscience was not proven by choosing the kindest outcome among dishonest rules, but by refusing to let powerful people disguise preventable harm as inevitability. Lucas asked whether she believed wealth itself was corrupting, and she replied that money only enlarged the habits already present in the person controlling it. His expression tightened because her words echoed something his mother had once said, before disappearing from his life during the scandal that destroyed his father's reputation. As they walked toward the train station, Lucas asked about the coffee shop she hoped to open, and Ava described a neighborhood place offering good coffee, late study hours, and paid training for teenagers seeking their first jobs. She explained that her mother had worked 2 jobs while raising her, and the only safe place Ava could study after school had been a small cafe whose owner never forced her to leave when she could afford only 1 drink. Lucas listened without interrupting, then asked why she had not used the $1 million offer to accelerate a dream that served other people. Ava answered that money arriving without trust could become another person's claim over her future, even when no contract acknowledged the ownership. The answer disturbed him because he had built an empire by purchasing influence others insisted they had freely sold. 2 days later, Michael confronted Lucas during a board meeting and demanded to know why a waitress had been allowed to overturn company policy. He warned that the experiment was becoming emotionally compromised, then mentioned Ava's community work and coffee shop savings with enough detail to reveal that someone had investigated her private life. Lucas had authorized only a basic background check for safety, not surveillance. Yet Michael produced photographs of Ava leaving the community center and copies of her rejected small business loan applications. Rebecca questioned where the records had come from, but Michael dismissed the concern and argued that knowing Ava's financial pressure made the test more meaningful. Lucas ordered every file destroyed, although he secretly kept 1 page after noticing the loan officer's name. That evening, Ava arrived at work and discovered Daniel waiting beside her locker with the envelope she had guarded for 4 years. The clasp had been opened, the savings counted, and a typed note had been placed inside beside the cash. Your dream requires $48,000. You currently have $19,620. The next opportunity will close the difference. Ava felt no temptation when she read the amount, only the cold realization that someone had entered the one place where her private hope had remained untouched. She called Lucas before her shift began and asked whether violating her privacy was part of his experiment. His silence lasted 1 second too long, and in that second, trust suffered its first fracture. Lucas arrived at Harrington House within 20 minutes, visibly furious, and accompanied by Rebecca, whose calm expression suggested the situation was worse than he had admitted over the phone. Ava met them in Daniel's office, where the opened envelope rested on the desk beside security footage showing a maintenance worker entering the locker room with a temporary access card. Lucas denied ordering the intrusion and explained that Michael had obtained information beyond the investigation he authorized. But Ava refused to let him separate himself completely from the machinery he had started. He had created an experiment based on unequal power, hired people to examine her life, and assumed boundaries would remain intact because he had written rules inside his own mind. Whether he had opened the envelope personally mattered less than the fact that his curiosity had given someone else permission to treat her privacy as research material. Rebecca traced the access card to a corporate security contractor used by Michael's office, while Daniel suspended the maintenance worker pending a formal investigation and offered Ava paid leave. Ava declined to disappear from her own workplace, but she ended the challenge immediately and asked Lucas never to contact her outside the restaurant again. Lucas accepted her decision without bargaining, then placed the unsigned $1 million agreement on the desk and tore it in half. She told him destroying the paper did not undo what had happened, and he answered that he knew, although his voice carried the humility of a man encountering consequences that could not be purchased away. Before leaving, he promised to identify everyone involved and provide the findings directly to her, even if the investigation exposed his company publicly. Michael reacted to Lucas's inquiry with practiced indignation, claiming the locker search had been an unauthorized attempt by an overzealous contractor to verify whether Ava's savings story was truthful. He insisted that investors routinely investigated people before offering substantial funds, and he reminded Lucas that the entire experiment had begun because both men believed public virtue often concealed private ambition. Lucas recognized the manipulation because it used his former beliefs as a shield. But Michael then revealed a detail that reopened an older wound. The loan officer who had rejected Ava's 3 business applications was Thomas Vale, the same banker who had testified against Lucas's father 19 years earlier and helped trigger the collapse of the Harrington family company. Michael suggested that Ava's presence might not be accidental, implying she had targeted the restaurant because of its connection to Lucas. For one dangerous hour, Lucas allowed suspicion to return, reviewing dates, applications, and employment records until coincidence began to resemble design. Ava had started at Harrington House 6 months after Thomas rejected her first loan, and Thomas's bank had recently competed against Harrington Ventures for control of several neighborhood properties. Rebecca warned Lucas that assembling unrelated facts into a betrayal was precisely how Michael wanted him to react, yet Lucas could not ignore the possibility that Ava had known more about him than she admitted. Instead of confronting her, he requested the original loan files through legal channels and discovered that Thomas had added handwritten comments describing Ava's concept as socially admirable but commercially naive. The financial models attached to her applications, however, projected stable revenue and included a guarantor whose name had been blacked out from the copies Michael obtained. Ava spent the following week trying to restore ordinary rhythm, but the intrusion changed the meaning of every glance, from a guest and every unfamiliar car outside the restaurant. No one noticed her unease and offered to walk her to the train, while Emily encouraged her to report the matter to police rather than trust a corporate investigation. Ava agreed, providing the footage and note to a detective who treated the unauthorized entry as potential theft and intimidation. The decision created consequences Lucas had not anticipated, because investigators requested communications from Michael's office and discovered references to something called the Bennett leverage package. Rebecca found the same phrase in archived board messages connected to a proposed acquisition of 3 city blocks near Ava's community center, including the building where she hoped eventually to lease space. The acquisition plan revealed that Harrington Ventures intended to replace several aging storefronts with luxury apartments, although Lucas had not reviewed the project beyond its expected returns. Michael had learned about Ava's dream through the background check, then planned to offer her a discounted cafe lease inside the new development as the final temptation. If she accepted, her success would become promotional evidence that the project benefited local residents, even as higher rents displaced many existing businesses. Lucas understood with disgust that Michael had transformed the experiment into a public relations strategy, using Ava's credibility to protect a deal she would likely oppose if given complete information. More painfully, Lucas recognized that he had created the conditions for the scheme by treating her principles as an asset waiting to be valued. He ordered the acquisition suspended and instructed Rebecca to send Ava every relevant document, despite legal counsel warning that disclosure could weaken negotiations and expose the firm to lawsuits. Ava received the files after midnight and read until dawn, discovering that Rose's Bakery, Marcus's proposed tutoring center, and the community center itself all occupied properties within the planned development zone. The earlier grant competition had not been independent philanthropy, as she had believed, but part of a neighborhood influence campaign designed to create sympathetic beneficiaries before redevelopment began. Although Lucas claimed he had not known the connection, his signature appeared on the original authorization, attached to a 100-page package he had approved electronically during a flight. Ava realized he had not lied about the details, yet his ignorance came from a kind of negligence available only to powerful people whose signatures changed lives they never bothered to see. The next afternoon, Ava requested one meeting with Lucas and chose the community center rather than his office or restaurant. She placed the documents between them and asked whether he wanted forgiveness, truth, or protection from Michael, because each goal required a different conversation. Lucas answered that he wanted to stop the project before anyone was displaced, expose the misuse of her information, and accept whatever judgment followed regarding his own responsibility. Ava told him stopping one deal would not change a system built to reward distance, then proposed a far more difficult remedy. Harrington Ventures should transfer the properties into a community land trust, preserve existing leases, and allow residents to shape development without surrendering ownership. Lucas explained that the board would resist, investors might sue, and Michael would use the financial loss to remove him as chief executive. Ava gathered the papers and said that perhaps the experiment had finally reached its honest stage, because this was the first choice that would cost Lucas something he actually valued. She did not ask him to sacrifice his company or prove himself through dramatic ruin, but she made clear that apologies without structural consequences would only turn remorse into another performance. Lucas watched her leave the classroom, then looked through the open doorway at teenagers studying beneath fluorescent lights in a building his signature had almost erased. When Rebecca called moments later, she reported that Michael had scheduled an emergency board vote for Monday morning and planned to present evidence that Lucas had become personally compromised by Ava. Lucas answered that Michael was correct about one thing, although not in the way he imagined. The experiment had compromised him by forcing him to see what his success looked like from the other side of a contract. Monday's board meeting began with Michael displaying photographs of Lucas at the restaurant, the grant interviews, and the community center, arranging ordinary moments into a narrative of obsession and impaired judgment. He argued that suspending the development threatened $80 million in projected returns, while transferring property to a land trust would violate Lucas's duty to investors. Several directors agreed that Michael's methods had crossed ethical boundaries, but they also believed Lucas's personal involvement with Ava had made his response financially irrational. Lucas did not defend himself by describing Ava's character or asking anyone to trust his motives, because doing so would repeat the mistake of making her credibility dependent upon his approval. Instead, he presented the hidden reimbursement change, the unauthorized surveillance, the Bennett leverage package, and internal messages showing Michael intended to use grant recipients as political cover. Michael dismissed the evidence as aggressive but legal strategy, then produced an email apparently sent from Ava to Thomas Vale 3 months before she met Lucas. The message thanked Thomas for advising her to seek employment at Harrington House, creating the impression that she had deliberately positioned herself near Lucas. For the first time, even Rebecca looked uncertain, and Michael requested an immediate vote to remove Lucas from operational control pending investigation. Lucas asked for a 2-hour delay to authenticate the message, but the board granted only 30 minutes. He called Ava because the evidence concerned her directly, despite promising not to involve her without consent, and explained exactly what had been presented. Ava denied sending the email, although she recognized the address as an account she had stopped using after a security breach the previous year. Rather than asking Lucas to believe her, Ava contacted the detective handling the locker intrusion and provided access records for the compromised account. Noah remembered that a former restaurant employee had recently asked questions about Ava's schedule, while Emily found an old notification showing the account password had been reset from an unfamiliar device. Digital records eventually traced the fraudulent login to a public network inside one of Michael's portfolio companies, but obtaining a formal report would take days. Ava understood that the board would vote before technical certainty arrived, so she searched her own paper files and found Thomas's original rejection letter, which advised her to gain management experience at any high-volume restaurant before applying again. The letter mentioned Harrington House only as one example among several, proving Michael's email had transformed general advice into evidence of a plan. Ava arrived at Harrington Ventures 10 minutes before the vote, not to rescue Lucas, but to correct a lie involving her name. She entered the conference room wearing the same navy coat she used for work and placed the letter beside Michael's printed email, inviting every director to compare the language. Michael claimed the letter could have been fabricated, until Rebecca produced metadata showing his assistant had requested archived information about Ava's compromised account days before the forged message was created. Silence spread around the table as Michael's confidence finally broke, revealing anger beneath the polished concern. He accused Lucas of allowing a waitress to dictate corporate policy, then told Ava that people like her always condemned wealth until someone offered enough access to make principles inconvenient. Ava answered that Michael had misunderstood her from the beginning because she did not object to wealth and had never considered poverty morally superior. She objected to people using resources as permission to remove choice from others, whether by opening a locker, changing grant rules, hiding redevelopment plans, or inventing evidence when the truth became unprofitable. Her words did not sound rehearsed, and several directors lowered their eyes because each example corresponded to a decision they had ignored. Lucas then proposed an independent investigation, Michael's immediate suspension, reimbursement for every affected applicant, and conversion of the development properties into a mixed community trust with residents holding controlling seats. He also offered to surrender his annual bonus and voting authority on the project, ensuring he could not personally benefit from the structure he was recommending. The board removed Michael by a narrow vote but postponed the land trust decision, demanding financial analysis and community consultation before approving a permanent transfer. Lucas retained his position under external oversight, a consequence he accepted without complaint, because accountability that preserved all his power would have meant nothing. Outside the conference room, he thanked Ava for appearing, and she reminded him that she had come to defend her own truth rather than protect his career. Lucas said he understood, then handed her the original background report and every copy recovered from company systems, along with written confirmation that her private information had been permanently deleted. He also provided the detective with evidence against Michael and the security contractor, despite knowing the investigation would attract public attention to his own role. News of the scandal reached Chicago media within hours, and Harrington House became crowded with reporters hoping to photograph Ava beside the billionaire whose moral experiment had become a corporate crisis. Daniel offered to hide her schedule, but Ava refused to let someone else's misconduct drive her from work. She issued one statement through the community center explaining that she would not discuss private relationships, although she supported transparent redevelopment, tenant protections, and accountability for unauthorized surveillance. The statement frustrated reporters because it offered no romance, revenge, or emotional spectacle, yet residents recognized that she had redirected attention toward the people most likely to lose homes and businesses. Lucas followed her example, publicly accepting responsibility for authorizing the investigation that enabled Michael's abuse and refusing to portray himself as another victim. Over the next month, community meetings replaced closed-door negotiations, revealing needs the original project had never considered. Residents wanted repaired apartments, safer sidewalks, childcare space, reliable grocery access, and commercial leases that did not rise beyond local incomes. Ava attended as a volunteer representative, but declined every invitation to become the project's spokesperson, insisting that one compelling personal story should not outweigh hundreds of quieter lives. Lucas attended without sitting on stage, answered hostile questions directly, and learned that listening for 3 hours required more discipline than delivering a polished presentation. Gradually, the land trust model gained enough support to become financially viable through tax incentives, lower return expectations, and partnerships with local credit unions. During the final meeting, Rosa announced she would reopen her bakery in one preserved storefront, while Marcus secured space for the tutoring center across the street. The community center received a 99-year lease at a symbolic rate, protecting it from future redevelopment pressure. Ava remained pleased but cautious, because institutional change could not be judged by a single agreement, and Lucas understood she was right. After the meeting, he asked whether she believed people could truly change or merely learn more convincing behavior. Ava told him change became believable only when it continued after praise disappeared and forgiveness remained uncertain. Lucas accepted the answer, then revealed that Michael had offered prosecutors evidence about an older Harrington scandal in exchange for leniency. The evidence suggested Lucas's father might not have stolen company funds as publicly believed, and Thomas Vale may have helped conceal the person who actually profited. Lucas had spent 19 years building his life around betrayal that could have been misunderstood, while every instinct urged him to abandon the community project and pursue the truth immediately. Ava saw the conflict in his face before he explained it, and she knew the next decision would reach deeper than money, reputation, or corporate control. For the first time, Lucas was not being asked what kind of man he wanted others to believe he had become. He was being asked whether he could seek justice without allowing old pain to turn another human being into an object of punishment. The records Michael surrendered showed that Lucas's father had approved a transfer later described as embezzlement, but the money had moved through an account controlled by Lucas's uncle, Stephen, who died before charges were filed. Thomas Vale had discovered the discrepancy while serving as the family company's lender, yet he withheld it after Stephen threatened to expose Thomas's own participation in illegal loans. Lucas's father accepted public blame to protect the company's employees from a collapse that would have eliminated pensions and health insurance, then died 2 years later without explaining the decision to his son. The revelation shattered the story Lucas had used to justify nearly every emotional distance in his adult life. He had believed his father's apparent betrayal proved trust was weakness, when the truth suggested a flawed man had sacrificed his name to protect thousands of people. Lucas wanted to confront Thomas immediately, but Rebecca warned that the evidence remained incomplete and could be manipulated by Michael to reduce his sentence. Ava did not advise forgiveness, because she understood that premature mercy could become another way of avoiding painful facts. She urged Lucas to separate 3 questions he had spent years treating as one: what his father had done, what Thomas had concealed, and what Lucas needed emotionally from the truth. He admitted that he wanted someone alive to blame, because anger felt more manageable than grieving a father he might have misunderstood. Ava told him that honesty sometimes removed the villain before it removed the pain, leaving people with no simple target and no excuse to remain unchanged. Thomas agreed to meet in a quiet conference room at the community center, refusing Lucas's office because he feared the conversation would become a legal ambush. He arrived appearing older than Ava remembered from her loan interviews, carrying a locked document case and the fatigue of a man who had rehearsed explanations for nearly 2 decades. Thomas admitted that he falsified part of the lender's report, protected Stephen's crimes, and allowed Lucas's father to remain publicly disgraced. He claimed fear had guided him at first, followed by career ambition, and then the growing impossibility of confessing, without destroying everything he had built. Lucas asked whether Thomas had rejected Ava's loans because he knew she worked at Harrington House, but Thomas denied any connection and produced notes showing he had considered her projections promising but undercapitalized. Ava challenged him on the phrase commercially naive, explaining that bankers often called community-centered plans unrealistic while funding luxury concepts built on displacement and debt. Thomas accepted the criticism and acknowledged that his decisions had been shaped by models designed to protect institutions from people with limited collateral, regardless of their competence. He then opened the case and produced letters Lucas's father had written but never sent, including one addressed to his son. Lucas hesitated before touching it, suddenly frightened that the final explanation might disappoint him more than uncertainty. Ava quietly left the room, understanding that witnessing every vulnerable moment would turn support into intrusion. In the letter, Lucas's father confessed that he had confused sacrifice with silence, believing he could protect his family by carrying shame alone. He apologized for leaving Lucas a false lesson about trust and warned that money could become a fortress whose owner eventually forgot whether it protected him or imprisoned him. The letter did not excuse his deception, and Lucas appreciated that honesty more than any attempt at sainthood. When he emerged from the room an hour later, he found Ava sitting on the building steps with 2 coffees from a nearby diner. She handed him one without asking what the letter contained, allowing him to decide whether grief should remain private. Lucas told her enough to explain that his father had been neither the villain he remembered nor the hero he might prefer to invent. He had acted courageously toward employees and dishonestly toward his own family, creating consequences that good intentions did not erase. Ava said, adulthood often began when people accepted that those who shaped them could be both loving and harmful, without one truth canceling the other. Lucas then apologized again for studying her, but this time he described the specific harm rather than the person he hoped to become. He acknowledged that he had treated her goodness as evidence for his worldview, invaded her privacy through negligent authority, and allowed his growing affection to exist inside conditions she had not freely chosen. Ava listened, then admitted that her anger had changed, although trust had not returned, simply because he finally understood the injury. She had also recognized something uncomfortable about herself, because pride had made her believe accepting help always meant surrendering independence. The mentorship program had shown her that guidance could be received without ownership, when boundaries were explicit and power remained shared. She told Lucas she had applied for the program under anonymous review, using her savings as equity and requesting education rather than a gift. Lucas promised he would have no role in evaluating her application, and Rebecca later confirmed an outside panel had already approved Ava based on her business plan. 6 months passed through practical work rather than emotional shortcuts. Ava completed courses in licensing, payroll, supplier contracts, and lease negotiation, while continuing her restaurant shifts and community tutoring. Lucas cooperated with the investigation, accepted a formal governance reprimand, and testified against Michael without exaggerating his own innocence. Thomas surrendered his banking license and provided restitution funds for employees harmed by the old scandal, while Lucas publicly restored his father's record without hiding the deception that remained. None of these actions produced immediate peace, but each replaced a convenient story with a more difficult truth. Ava eventually signed a lease for a small corner storefront owned by the Community Land Trust, investing her entire savings while receiving a standard low-interest loan from a local credit union. On the evening she received the keys, she stood alone inside the empty room, listening to traffic beyond dusty windows and imagining warm lights where bare wires hung from the ceiling. Lucas arrived only because she had invited him, carrying no check, flowers, or symbolic grand gesture. He brought a toolbox and spent 3 hours helping remove warped shelves, proving surprisingly incompetent with a drill, but willing to follow instructions without turning assistance into leadership. When they finished, Ava opened the old coffee shop dream envelope and removed the final $20 bill she had saved from her last shift. She placed it inside the future cash register as the cafe's first dollar, then asked Lucas whether he still believed every person had a price. He answered that everyone had needs, fears, and compromises, but reducing those complexities to price was how powerful people avoided the responsibility of understanding them. Ava smiled, because the answer contained no polished certainty, only a man learning to live without the protection of cynicism. Before they left, She handed him a spare key and explained that it was not forgiveness, a promise, or permission to assume what came next. It was simply trust in one small, specific form, freely offered and therefore more valuable than anything he had once tried to purchase. Bennett Coffee House opened on a cold October morning without reporters, celebrity guests, or any announcement from Harrington Ventures. Ava wanted the first customers to be the people who had watched the neighborhood survive long before investors discovered its value, so Rosa delivered pastries before sunrise. Marcus brought students carrying handmade signs, and Noah arrived wearing the first employee apron. The cafe offered strong coffee, simple food, evening tutoring tables, and a paid training program for young workers who needed experience without being treated as disposable labor. Every decision reflected lessons Ava had earned through years of service. Although the first week also exposed mistakes no dream had prepared her to face. A refrigerator failed, a supplier missed 2 deliveries, and payroll software nearly withheld Noah's first check, forcing Ava to confront the uncomfortable truth that good intentions did not automatically create good management. Lucas visited only when invited, usually taking a table near the window and paying for whatever he ordered, without expecting private attention. Their relationship rebuilt itself through ordinary reliability, including return calls, respected boundaries, honest disagreements, and the absence of pressure when either person needed distance. Ava gradually learned that Lucas could listen without converting every problem into a solution, while Lucas learned that affection was not proven by becoming indispensable. They sometimes walked to the train after closing, discussing books, business failures, family memories, and the difference between loneliness and solitude. Nothing about their closeness erased what had happened, but it no longer remained the only truth between them. 3 months after opening, the cafe faced its first genuine crisis when an anonymous online account published photographs from Lucas's original surveillance file and accused Ava of building her business through a secret romantic arrangement. The post claimed the land trust, mentorship approval, and loan had all been manipulated, while edited messages made it appear that Ava had promised to support the redevelopment in exchange for financial backing. Customers began canceling events, and one local journalist requested evidence that her application had received independent review. The old version of Lucas would have threatened lawsuits before sunrise and used influence to remove every accusation. But Ava insisted that aggressive suppression would make the allegations appear credible. She released her loan documents, application scores, lease terms, and personal investment records, while the land trust published the identities of independent reviewers who had never met Lucas. Rebecca traced the anonymous account to Michael's former public relations consultant, who had retained illegal copies of the surveillance package before company systems were purged. Prosecutors added witness intimidation and data theft charges, yet Ava refused to frame the scandal as proof that critics should never question powerful relationships. She acknowledged publicly that Lucas's misconduct had created the original material and that skepticism was reasonable, although the specific claims about her business were false. Her honesty disarmed the story more effectively than denial, because she separated accountability from shame and refused to edit the past into a cleaner narrative. Within 2 weeks, customers returned, many carrying notes about times their own achievements had been dismissed as favors rather than earned work. The crisis also forced Lucas to confront the final consequence of his experiment, because even after his behavior changed, Ava continued paying a public price for choices he had made privately. He offered to step away from her life if his presence threatened the cafe, but she rejected the decision because it disguised withdrawal as sacrifice, while once again deciding what was best without her consent. She told him remaining would require patience, humility, and acceptance, that strangers might misunderstand them for years. Lucas answered that leaving to protect his image of redemption would only repeat the habit of choosing control over relationship. This time, he asked what she wanted rather than offering what made him feel noble. Ava wanted the truth to remain visible without becoming the center of everything they built afterward. She also wanted Lucas to expand independent oversight across Harrington Ventures, ensuring no employee, applicant, or community partner could be investigated without consent, necessity, and external review. Lucas implemented the policy with board approval, then funded a privacy rights clinic through an irrevocable grant administered by people outside his company. He did not attach Ava's name, although she later agreed to serve on an advisory committee once assured she could criticize the program publicly. The clinic's first cases involved workers whose personal data had been collected during hiring and tenants screened by automated systems they could not challenge. 1 year after the envelope disappeared at Harrington House, Henry Collins entered Bennett Coffee House with his granddaughter, now a freshman at Northwestern University. Noah recognized him immediately, and the room seemed to hold its breath as the older man approached. Henry explained that his granddaughter had persuaded him to return because his private apology after the accusation had never addressed the public humiliation he caused. In front of customers, he admitted that fear had made him suspicious of the person with the least power, and thanked Ava for demanding evidence when everyone else accepted convenience. Noah told him forgiveness did not erase the memory, but he accepted the apology because Henry had finally named the harm without asking to be comforted. Lucas watched from the window table and understood that the moment completed something the million-dollar challenge never could. Integrity was not a permanent quality revealed by one perfect choice. Because Ava had made mistakes as an owner, Lucas had caused damage while believing himself rational. Henry had judged Noah unfairly, and even well-intentioned institutions had failed people through neglect. Character appeared in what each person did after truth became inconvenient, especially when repair required more than words. The lesson was less elegant than the experiment Lucas once imagined, but it was more humane because it allowed people to change without pretending their consequences had vanished. That evening, after the last student left and Noah locked the front door, Ava carried 2 mugs to the table where Lucas had waited. She placed the worn coffee shop dream envelope between them, now filled with letters from young employees describing what their first job had allowed them to accomplish. Ava told him she had once believed the envelope represented independence, while she now understood it represented something broader, the freedom to choose which forms of help strengthened dignity and which ones quietly demanded surrender. Lucas reached inside his coat, and she laughed when he produced not a check, but a folded piece of paper covered with handwritten questions. He explained that he had been invited to speak at a business school about ethical investment, but he no longer trusted speeches that offered certainty without examination. Ava read the first question, which asked how leaders could distinguish generosity from control when both produced visible benefits. She told him the answer would depend on whether recipients could refuse, negotiate, criticize, and leave without punishment. Lucas wrote her words down, then asked whether she would attend the lecture and challenge him publicly if he simplified anything. Ava agreed, although she warned that honesty in front of students might cost him some admiration. Lucas smiled and said admiration had become less valuable since he learned how easily it could exist without understanding. Outside, snow began falling over the neighborhood, softening the city lights without silencing the traffic beneath them. Ava turned the cafe sign to closed, then placed the old envelope inside a glass frame beside the counter. Not as proof that she had refused $1 million, but as a reminder that no dream should require its owner to surrender the right to define success. When she returned to Lucas, he offered his hand without assumption, and she chose to take it.